Everyone knows that prayer breaks a financial curse. You pray, you fast, you tithe, you wait. That is the formula. That is what every pastor, every church pamphlet, every well-meaning aunt has told you since you were a child. And Solomon, the wisest king who ever lived, the man God personally gifted with wisdom beyond every other human being in recorded history, he agreed with that formula too. Right? Someone sent me a message last week. She wrote, "Emeka, my grandmother always said our family carries a money curse. Is that biblical?" I read that message 3 times before I answered her, because the honest answer is more complicated than yes or no. And the deeper answer, the one I want to give you tonight, is not what either of us expected to find. Because here is what nobody tells you. Solomon did not just pray against poverty. Solomon commanded it. There is a difference between those 2 words, and by the end of tonight, you will understand why that difference might be the exact thing standing between you and the version of your life you keep almost reaching. Before I go further, I want to ask you to subscribe. Not because I need the number, because of what is coming in the next few minutes. YouTube only shows the deeper layers of this kind of research to people who signal they want to keep going. And where we are going tonight gets uncomfortable in a way that most channels will not touch. If you are the kind of person who wakes up at 3 in the morning for no reason you can explain, you are going to want to be subscribed before we get to the part about why. Let me start where most people start, because I started there too. The first layer is simple. Financial hardship, in the biblical worldview, is not always just bad luck or bad math. It can be the result of something real, something with a name, something written into Scripture with startling directness. Proverbs 3, verse 33. The Lord's curse is on the house of the wicked, but he blesses the dwelling of the righteous. That is not poetry. That is not metaphor dressed up to sound dramatic. That is Solomon, the man who built the temple, the man whose wealth was so vast that silver was as common as stone in Jerusalem during his reign, stating plainly that a household can carry an active curse. I spent years at SOAS in London studying ancient Near Eastern languages before I ever touched Solomonic texts seriously, and one of the first things you learn is that biblical Hebrew does not do vague. The word used here, nava, does not mean life in some abstract spiritual sense. It refers to the dwelling, the pastoral estate, the actual material assets of an agrarian household. Bruce Waltke, whose commentary on Proverbs remains the standard academic reference used at Eerdmans and taught across serious seminaries, points this out clearly. This verse is not about feelings. It is about whether the flocks multiply or die, whether the harvest holds or fails, whether the household economy is protected or dismantled. Solomon is describing something structural, something that attaches itself to a house and either builds it or bleeds it. So layer 1 is this. Everyone knows curses are spiritual. What almost nobody tells you is that in Solomon's own writing, a curse is described in the language of economics. Not feelings, assets. But wait, that is not the worst part, because if you stop there, you still have not understood what Solomon actually believed poverty was. Most people, when they think about a financial curse, imagine something passive, an absence, a lack of blessing, like a tap that simply is not running. That is comforting in a strange way because an absence does not have intention. An absence is not hunting you. Solomon did not describe it that way. Not once. Not in the entire book of Proverbs. Look closely at Proverbs 6 verses 10 and 11. A little sleep, a little slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest, and poverty will come upon you like a robber, and want like an armed man. Read that again. Poverty comes like a robber. Want arrives like an armed man. That is not passive language. That is not the language of absence. That is the language of assault. And here is the detail that stopped me cold the first time a colleague at Oxford pointed it out to me during a seminar on wisdom literature. Solomon does not use that phrase once. He uses it twice, word for word, almost identical, in Proverbs 24, verse 34. In a book made of hundreds of individual proverbs, almost none of which repeat, Solomon chose to say the exact same thing about poverty in the exact same words in two separate places. Scholars working through the Hebrew text, including analysis published through Translation Insights and Perspectives at SEL International, have noted this is not an accident of compilation. It is deliberate literary emphasis. When an ancient Hebrew author repeats himself precisely, he is underlining something he needs you to remember with your whole body, not just your mind. There is a second detail in the Hebrew that most translations quietly smooth over, and once you see it, you cannot unsee it. The word rendered armed man in most English Bibles is ish magen, which more literally carries the sense of a man carrying a shield, a trained man, someone equipped and prepared, rather than a desperate opportunist grabbing whatever he can. This is not a starving vagrant stumbling into your house by accident. This is a professional, someone who has done this before, to other houses, and knows exactly how long to wait before he moves. Solomon was not describing misfortune. He was describing a strategy, and strategies can be studied, anticipated, and countered in a way that misfortune cannot. Think about what that means. The wisest man who ever lived did not describe poverty as a whole. He described it as a hunter, armed, deliberate, coming for you specifically, at a specific pace, waiting for a specific moment of weakness. A little sleep, a little slumber. Not laziness in the way we use that word casually. A state of passivity, a state of not fighting back. This is where it gets uncomfortable. If poverty is a robber, if want is an armed man, then the question is no longer, why am I unlucky? The question becomes, what happens when you pray against an armed man the way you would pray for a parking space? Because those are not the same kind of prayer. And I think most of us, myself included for a long time, have been using the wrong kind. My mother used to draw symbols on the doorframe of our house in Nsuka. I was maybe 8 years old, and I remember asking her why, and she said something I dismissed for 20 years as folk superstition. She said, "This is not decoration, this is a boundary. You do not politely ask a thief to leave your house, you bar the door." I filed that memory away under things my mother believed for 2 decades, filed next to my father's gentle academic skepticism about all of it, the historian at UCL who loved my mother completely and never once told her she was wrong, but never quite told her she was right either. Then I found something in the basement archive of the British Museum that made me sit in a cold reading room for 40 minutes without moving. Here is the second layer, and it is heavier than the first. If poverty is described as an armed intruder, then the appropriate response is not passive petition. It is confrontation. And Solomon, according to sources far older and far stranger than the Proverbs most people quote from a pulpit, did not confront spiritual opposition by asking nicely. The Testament of Solomon is a text most Christians have never heard of, and most churches will never mention from the pulpit, even though it circulated for centuries in the same world that produced the New Testament. It is not scripture. I want to be precise about that, because precision matters when you are dealing with material this old. It is a pseudepigraphal text, meaning it was written in Solomon's name by later authors, dated by scholars like Dennis Dooling, whose analysis appeared in the Journal for the Study of Judaism, and later expanded on by Sarah Schwartz in the Journal for the Study of the Pseudepigrapha, to somewhere between the 1st and 5th century of the Common Era. It is not inspired scripture, but it is one of the oldest surviving windows into how the ancient world understood Solomon's actual method. Not his reputation, his method. And the method recorded there is not prayer in the way we use that word today. In the text, a demon named Ornias appears, and he is described doing something oddly specific and oddly modern. He steals half the wages of a young boy that Solomon favored. Half his salary drained away through the boy's own thumb, night after night, while the boy weakens and cannot explain why. That detail alone should stop you. Not sickness in the dramatic sense, not possession in the way film has trained us to picture it. A quiet, specific, ongoing theft of income and vitality that the boy could feel but could not name. Solomon's response was not to fast for 40 days and hope Ornias grew tired and left. Solomon received a ring, a signet from the archangel Michael, and he used it, along with the spoken name of God, to command Ornias. Not request, not plead, command. The demon was made to work, forced into labor cutting stone for the temple, subdued not through patience, but through precise, verbal authority, wielded with full confidence that it would work. This is where the two threads I have been pulling on this whole video come together. And I need you to sit with this for a second, because it reframes everything I said in the first layer. If poverty in the Proverbs is described as an armed robber, and if Solomon's own tradition shows him subduing spiritual opposition not through soft supplication, but through direct verbal command, then the two ideas are not separate. They are the same idea, told twice, in two different genres. The proverb tells you what poverty is. The Testament tells you what Solomon actually did about things like it. There is another figure in the same text worth naming, because he sharpens the pattern even further. A demon called Asmodeus appears later in the Testament, and Solomon interrogates him directly, asking him plainly what his function is, what he does to households. Asmodeus answers that he works to destroy marriages, to scatter what has been built between people, to turn provision into scarcity through discord rather than through direct theft. Solomon's response, again, is not a general blessing spoken over the household. It is specific counter-instruction tailored to the specific function of the specific spirit standing in front of him. This is the pattern I want you to notice before we go further. Nowhere in this tradition does Solomon treat opposition as one undifferentiated fog to be prayed against in general terms. He identifies the function, and then he speaks directly to that function. Generic prayer meets generic results. Named opposition met with specific command is what the tradition consistently describes as effective. Someone always asks me at this point, and I want to answer it directly instead of dancing around it. Are Proverbs just ancient wisdom literature, practical maxims for daily life? And is treating them as spiritual weapons a modern invention? Something Pentecostal preachers layered on top of a much simpler text centuries later? I used to believe that too, honestly. But the oldest Solomonic material we have, the Testament itself, the very tradition that produced the wisdom sayings people quote so casually, already treats verbal declaration as an instrument of control over affliction. This is not a modern misreading. This is the original function of the corpus, documented in academic journals, not invented on a stage. And someone else will say, reasonably, that poverty has structural causes. Economic systems, bad policy, historical injustice. That blaming a curse lets the real culprits off the hook. I want to be honest with you. Deuteronomy, the very book Solomon copied out by hand as a young king, commands rulers not to exploit workers. Proverbs itself says, "The field of the poor may yield much food, but is swept away through injustice." The biblical worldview does not deny that systems oppress people. It does not ask you to stop noticing injustice. It asks a narrower, sharper question underneath all of that. Is there also an instrument of spiritual agency available to you regardless of where the hardship originated? Not instead of accountability for unjust systems, alongside it. Now here is the third layer, and this is the one nobody wants to hear, because it is the one that makes this personal instead of academic. If poverty behaves like an armed intruder, and if Solomon's method for confronting spiritual opposition was direct verbal command rather than passive request, then there is a question sitting underneath everything I have said so far that I have been avoiding. When? At what hour does an armed man actually attack a house? Not at noon, when the household is alert and the doors are watched. At night. In the deep hours when the house is undefended because everyone assumes they are safe. This is the part where I need to tell you about the hour, because I think this is the detail my mother understood instinctively that took me 12 years of research to catch up to intellectually. Acts chapter 16. Paul and Silas, beaten, imprisoned, chained to the wall of a Roman jail in Philippi. At midnight, not at dawn when hope naturally returns, not at the moment of their arrest when adrenaline was highest, But at midnight, in the depth of the hardest hour, they prayed and sang, and an earthquake broke every chain in that prison. Matthew Henry, writing his commentary on the whole Bible in the early 1700s, a text still read by serious students of Scripture today, observed something specific about this. He called their prayer a midnight watch and connected it directly to Exodus, to the night God moved through Egypt and broke Pharaoh's grip at precisely midnight, the hour recorded in Exodus 12, verse 29. Gideon's army struck the Midianite camp at night in the middle watch, according to Judges 7. The pattern is not decorative. Across Scripture, the hour of God's most dramatic reversals is not morning. It is consistently, specifically, the deep of night. Solomon, who copied the entire Torah by hand as king, who quoted its curses and blessings almost verbatim throughout Proverbs, would have known this pattern the way you know your own name. The armed robber in Proverbs 6 does not strike at noon. He strikes when the house has stopped watching, which means the appropriate hour to stand against him is not whenever is convenient for you. It is precisely the hour he expects you to be asleep. I know some of you are already uncomfortable because I get messages about this specific hour more than almost anything else I discuss on this channel. People tell me, I tried praying at midnight, but I fell asleep. Or worse, I wake up at 3 in the morning feeling afraid, feeling like something heavy is sitting on my chest, and I do not understand why. And I am scared to pray then, because what if I invite something worse? I want to answer that fear directly, because it deserves a real answer, not a dismissal. Here is what the science actually says, separate from any theology at all. Between roughly 2 and 4 in the morning, your body temperature hits its lowest point of the entire day. Your cortisol, the hormone that keeps you alert and defended and psychologically armored, is at its absolute minimum. This is documented, consolidated circadian neurophysiology, not speculation. Your brain, at that hour, sits in its most permeable state, its lowest threshold for altered awareness, its thinnest psychological armor of the entire 24-hour cycle. What the biblical tradition calls the midnight watch and what modern neuroscience calls the hypnagogic vulnerability window are two different vocabularies pointing at the exact same observed hour. Paul and Silas did not choose midnight by coincidence. Whether you read that moment through faith or through physiology, both descriptions land on precisely the same clock. So when you wake at 3 without explanation, feeling exposed instead of rested, I am not going to tell you that is nothing. I am also not going to tell you to be afraid of it. I am going to tell you what my mother told me on that doorstep in Ensuka. You do not run from the hour the intruder chooses. You use it. That hour, the one that frightens you, is not evidence that you are being hunted with no recourse. It is the exact hour Scripture identifies, repeatedly, as the hour of ambush in the other direction. Your ambush, not his. I want to pause here and be honest with you about something, because I think honesty is owed at this point in the video. I found the Testament of Solomon in a reading room in the British Museum during a research trip that was supposed to be routine. I was cataloging Solomonic manuscript fragments, a task I had done 100 times before without much emotion attached to it. And there, in a Greek fragment, was a description of a protective symbol drawn at a threshold to bar a specific kind of affliction from entering a household. I sat with that page for 40 minutes because I recognized the shape. My mother drew that exact configuration on our doorframe in Nasuka when I was a boy, and I had spent 20 years quietly filing it under superstition. My father, ever the careful UCL historian, would have wanted 3 peer-reviewed sources before he called it anything more than folklore. My mother needed none. She had simply been taught it, mother to daughter, across a lineage neither of us could trace on paper. Standing in that reading room, I understood for the first time that the manuscript and my mother were not 2 separate claims about the world. They were the same claim, arriving to me through 2 different roads, 20 years apart. That is the part of this work that I still have not fully made peace with. Not the theology, the convergence. I want to be honest about the limits of what I am telling you, because a researcher who never admits uncertainty is not someone you should trust. The Testament of Solomon is not scripture. It carries no canonical authority, and I would never tell you to treat it as equal to the Proverbs themselves. But historians do not discard a text simply because it falls outside the canon. They ask what it reveals about how the earliest communities around Solomon actually understood him, centuries before medieval legend reshaped his image into the caricature of a wizard with a magic ring that most people picture today. And what it reveals, consistently, across multiple independent demon interrogations in that text, is a man who treated affliction as something with structure, something nameable, something that responds to precise verbal authority rather than vague hope. Whatever you conclude about the text's authority, that underlying pattern, name it and speak to it directly, shows up again in the Proverbs, in Deuteronomy, in Paul's prison cell. It is not one strange document standing alone. It is one thread running through the entire span of the tradition. There is a figure I think about often in this context, and I want to bring him in now because his story is the closest thing I have to a modern demonstration of everything I have just described. Dr. D.K. Olukoya holds a doctorate in molecular genetics from the University of Reading in the United Kingdom, with more than 70 peer-reviewed scientific publications to his name before he ever built a ministry. This is not a man without rigor. In 1989, during a period of severe personal hardship, he began a sustained practice of midnight prayer, systematically applying the Psalms and the Proverbs of Solomon as what he called points of warfare, declared aloud, not read silently, concentrated specifically in the hours between midnight and 3 in the morning. What he built from that practice, Mountain of Fire and Miracles Ministries, grew from a single house gathering in Lagos into a movement present in more than 110 countries. I am not asking you to treat that number as proof of theology. I am asking you to notice that a man trained to the highest Western scientific standard looked at the same ancient pattern my mother inherited without any formal education at all, and arrived independently at the same hour, the same method, the same insistence on speaking, rather than merely hoping. When a geneticist from Reading and a woman from Nusuka reach the identical conclusion through completely different roads, I think that convergence is worth more than either claim standing alone. Now go back for a second to that first sentence I said to you tonight. Everyone knows that prayer breaks a financial curse. Do you hear it differently now? Prayer was the word we used because it was safe, because it did not require us to admit that Solomon's actual method looked less like a quiet request and more like a command spoken with total certainty at the exact hour an armed man expects no resistance. The obvious version was not wrong. It was incomplete in exactly the way that made it comfortable, and in the end, made it too weak to work. You were right to believe something real was happening in your family. You were simply aiming the wrong kind of words at it. So let me give you what I promised at the start of this video. Not 3 verses read flatly, one after another, like a grocery list. 3 specific instruments, and what each one is actually built to do. The first is Proverbs 3:33. This is your acknowledgement. It names the thing plainly, without flinching, without softening it into vague spiritual language. A household can carry a curse, and a household can carry a blessing, and Scripture treats both as materially real, not metaphorical. You are not being dramatic when you say something in your family's finances feels intentional rather than accidental. Solomon said the exact same thing 3,000 years before your grandmother did. The second is Proverbs 6, 10, and 11, repeated with total precision in 24:34. This is your identification. Poverty is not a fog. It is not an absence. It is a robber, an armed man, moving with intention and choosing his hour with care. You do not negotiate with an armed man. You do not politely request that he leave. You name him for exactly what he is, and naming him correctly is the difference between hoping he goes away and actually driving him out. The third is Proverbs 10:22. The blessing of the Lord makes rich, and he adds no sorrow with it. This is your target, the thing you are actually declaring toward, not just the thing you are declaring against. Notice what it does not say. It does not say wealth without cost. It says wealth without the specific sorrow, the specific exhausting toil, the specific 3 generations of almost succeeding, and then watching it collapse at the last moment that so many of you have described to me in messages. That collapse, that pattern of almost and then nothing, is precisely the signature of the armed robber from verse 6. This verse is what his absence actually looks like. Not just less struggle. A different kind of increase entirely, one that does not carry that specific exhausting weight. Here is how they work together, because none of them alone is the full instrument. 333 tells you the house can be cursed or blessed, so you stop treating your situation as random. 611 tells you exactly what you are facing, so you stop praying vaguely against fog and start speaking directly to an intruder. 1022 tells you what you are declaring toward, so your words have a destination and not just an enemy. Acknowledge. Identify. Target. That is not a list. That is a sequence. The same way a locksmith does not randomly try keys, but moves through a deliberate order until the mechanism turns. And the hour matters as much as the words. Not because midnight is magic in some superstitious sense divorced from everything I have shown you tonight, but because it is the hour Scripture repeatedly identifies as the moment of reversal, and it is the hour your own body is, right now, biologically most exposed and most reachable. If you wake at 3 without explanation, that is not a malfunction to medicate into silence and forget. Speak the acknowledgement. Speak the identification. Speak the target. Do not perform it as ritual recitation. Say it the way you would say something to a person standing in your doorway who has no business being there. Picture the specific moment this is actually for, because I do not want this to stay abstract for you. It is not the calm afternoon when you are reading comfortably with a cup of tea, feeling philosophical about ancient texts. It is the exact night this week when you wake at 3 with your heart already moving fast before your mind has even caught up. The ceiling above you unfamiliar in the dark, that specific pressure sitting on your chest that you have described to me in messages more times than I can count. That is not a random malfunction of your nervous system to be pushed away with your phone screen and forgotten by morning. That is the hour. You do not need a special room, a candle, or anyone's permission. You sit up in that same bed, in that same dark, and you speak the acknowledgement, the identification, and the target out loud in your own voice, the way you would speak to someone you had caught standing uninvited in your own doorway. Not a whisper of hope directed at the ceiling. Words directed at what is actually there. This is also the moment I think about the 3 generations my mother used to mention, without ever fully explaining. My great-grandmother. My grandmother? My mother. Each of them carrying some version of the same weight before they had the words for it that I am giving you tonight. If your family has its own version of that pattern, a father who left nothing but debt, a grandfather before him who left the same, you are not required to keep calling it bad decisions out of politeness. You are permitted to call it what Solomon called it, and you are permitted to speak to it directly, tonight, at the hour it expects you to be asleep. If Dr. Olukoya's story revealed anything to me, it is that rigor and faith are not opposites, whatever my father's generation of careful academics assumed. The same mind that publishes 70 peer-reviewed papers can also stand in a room at 3 in the morning and speak with total conviction. Those are not 2 different men wearing different masks. That is one whole man, refusing to let either half of himself go silent. I think about my mother's hands on that doorframe, more than almost anything else from my childhood. She was not decorating. She was drawing a line and daring something to cross it. I spent 20 years of academic training learning to doubt that instinct, and 12 years of manuscript research slowly finding out she never needed my doubt in the first place. She already knew what I had to travel to London, to Ethiopia, to a cold reading room in the British Museum, to finally understand. My father, gentle scholar that he was, would have wanted me to end this video with a careful qualification, Some acknowledgement that correlation is not causation, that convergence between an ancient text and a mother's folk practice proves nothing in the strict academic sense. He would have been right, in his own careful way, but my mother would have asked a different question entirely. Not whether it can be proven in a journal, whether it works when you are standing at the door at 3 a.m. with nothing else left to try. I have come to believe both of my parents were answering the same question from 2 different rooms in the same house. You do not have to choose between being someone who thinks carefully and someone who believes deeply. Solomon never chose. He built a temple with mathematical precision and spoke to armed spiritual forces in the same lifetime, sometimes in the same breath. The blessing was never absent from your house. It was contested, and now you know what to say, and exactly when to say it, and exactly what has been standing in the doorway all along. If any part of tonight's research resonated with what your own family has carried, silently, for longer than anyone wants to admit, I want to ask you for something specific. This kind of research, the manuscript archives, the academic journals, the months spent cross-referencing a Greek pseudepigraphal fragment against a Hebrew wisdom text, none of that is cheap or fast, and very few channels are willing to do it properly instead of reading a verse and moving on. If tonight gave you something you can actually use at 3 a.m, consider leaving a super thanks. It is not charity. It is what allows this specific kind of slow, careful, uncomfortable work to keep existing on this platform, work that most creators will not touch because it takes too long to do honestly. You are not just watching a video. You are one of the people who makes it possible for the next one to exist. Before you go, I want to hear from you, because your answer matters more than you think for what I research next. When you got to the part about the armed robber, about poverty having intention instead of just being bad luck, did that reframe anything for you? Write it in the comments. Tell me if there is a pattern in your family that suddenly looks different tonight than it did an hour ago. I read every one of them, and more of these videos come directly from the questions you leave here than from anywhere else. Sleep well tonight. Or don't. Either way, you now know what to say when you wake.